our ultimate longing finds satisfaction and blessing at having found ourselves at rest, at peace in God's house. Deep in the woods is a house, just a house, that once was, but now isn't a home. Inside the house, it is silent but creaking, or whispering mostly, but not really speaking. We whisper, though no one would mind if we didn't, that someone who once was is someone who isn't, and the someone who once was is gone. And so begins this delightful children's story about a house that once was. And it's about two children that have come upon an abandoned house, and they kind of wonder what the story is behind the house and the people that lived in it, and why it's no longer a home. Some of my earliest memories include some time spent exploring an abandoned house that was in the middle of my family's pasture, and whenever my sister and I would go with my dad to check the cows. And we would imagine what fixing up that old home would look like, and the sort of flowery curtains that you put in the window. And likewise, just as playing house is one of the first few games it seems that many children play, it seems that the idea of home is as old as literature itself. Art and pop culture have been captured by the idea of home and what makes a house a home. So much so that in the first few lines of a popular song called House of the Rising Sun, it begins with, "There is a house way down in New Orleans they call the Rising Sun," even though that's admittedly a very different kind of house that's far less nostalgic than the one of our children's storybook, but nonetheless is certainly iconic in our culture, or across cultures. But I think if I asked you to name one thing that makes your house a home, maybe you would pick the color of your wallpaper. My sister says that a kitchen that's yellow is what makes a house a home. Or maybe it's the smell of freshly baked bread or your favorite fuzzy blanket. I think there are 1,000 ways in which we might feel at home, whether it's a certain sensation, or hopefully because of a beloved person's presence, or simply, as one cheeky Pinterest quote says, home is where the Wi-Fi connects. It's a little bit cheeky, but maybe it's a furry friend for you. Mark Twain once said that a home without a cat and a well-fed, well-petted, properly revered cat, it might be a perfect home, but has it actually proved that title? Which I thought was clever. But I think if, as another author, Maya Angelou says, that the ache for home lives in all of us, then that sort of nostalgia runs very deeply in our psalm this morning. This particular psalm wants you to conjure up all of the feels, the fuzzy blanket, the favorite mug, and maybe even the cat in the corner. Because finally, as the psalm is intended for pilgrims as they recite on one of their many worship festivals to Jerusalem, finally this psalmist feels at home. And specifically, not just because they feel at home in one particular location, whether that was Jerusalem or Galilee or wherever they were traveling from, because after all, they've always been a people on the move, but specifically, they've realized that they finally feel at home in God's presence. After all of their yearning and sojourning, wayfaring and traveling, they have finally come home. And like the way that the father opens wide his arms in the parable of the prodigal son, so too this psalmist has been welcomed in when returning to God's sanctuary. And it's why they find this ultimate blessing. Happy is the one who finds their centering as they dwell in God's home. But I think before we write off the simplicity of coming home to God's presence in the same way that we might watch a sparrow nest, which I think is a very beautiful image, we do know that for many in our community, the idea of home is painful, if elusive. Maybe home was not a place of safety, but instead it was a place of dysfunction or even abuse. Maybe home doesn't conjure up some warm, fuzzy feelings because the person that was there is no longer, or because it never existed for us in the first place. Home, for some of us, especially in South Africa, it might be the street, or it might be a settlement, and its place is far more temporary than some permanent location. And I think that's why for God's people that's always on the move, whether they're in exile or exodus, this psalm still finds some resonance. I think whether home for you is a stationary point or some kind of moving target. This psalm invites us to move beyond the four walls of what we might think of as a home, and instead consider how resting in God's presence, no matter where we are at on our pilgrimage of life, and that's how we return home. We are blessed, not because we reside in a particular geographic location, but because God loves us and has created a place for us. We claim our home in God, and when we do so, that's when we're blessed, and when we find that we may be happy in that place as the ones who live in his house. Augustine, an early church theologian, is famous for his expression of longing satisfied when he wrote of God, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." I'm sure you've heard that quote before, and while our restless hearts are always looking for some place for rest, a place to find true and abiding peace, a place to call home, I think that we discover when we rest in God's presence, that's where our heart's ultimate home is. Our ultimate longing finds satisfaction and blessing that having found ourselves at rest, at peace in God's house. But we're not meant to keep that peace for ourselves. Instead, the psalm also invites us to become extensions of that blessed hospitality. The psalmist reminds us that it's better to be a doorkeeper in God's house, or a doormat like we had earlier, to welcome others to be at home with God as well. And as a doorkeeper of God's house, we can either be like a greeter that we might see hopefully on a Sunday morning that warmly welcomes others, or as another commentator wrote, we can become a bit like a bouncer at a bar who keeps others from entering. And I think it's tempting to sometimes not want it to feel like maybe there's an overly familiar house guest who's constantly rifling through your linen drawers, and that makes it a little hard to extend hospitality. But the point in becoming God's doorkeepers is not so we get to decide who's worthy to enter in, but rather realizing that resting in God's presence is for everyone. Everyone may find a home in God.